Well, good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, COVID-19 Vaccines, Clinical Trials, Approval, and Addressing Public Hesitancy. My name is Kirsten Matthews. I'm the Fellow in Science and Technology Policy at the Baker Institute, and I'm the Director of the Science and Technology Policy Program and the Biomedical Research Program, which is within the Center for Health and Biosciences. Today's event is a collaboration with the Baker Institute Center for Health and Biosciences and the Immunization Partnership. Before we start, I want to thank our donors. First, I would like to thank Community Health Choice, who funded a grant with the Immunization Partnership to sponsor the event and research on vaccine policies in Texas. Results of this research includes a study of vaccine-related bills filed in Texas state legislature from 2009 and 2019. In addition, related to today's program is a short review of Operation Warp Speed's vaccine program. There should be links to both papers available in the chat if you're interested in viewing them. I would also like to thank and acknowledge funding from the Kavli Foundation and the National Science Foundation, who are sponsoring a series of webinars with the Baker Institute focused on science policy and public understanding of science. Now I'm just going to hand off the program to our moderator for the panel, Ms. Rekha Lakshmanan. Rekha is a contributing expert for the Center for Health and Bioscience at the Baker Institute. He is the Director of Public Policy at the Immunization Partnership in Houston, Texas. Her work involves developing and implementing public policy strategies to improve Texas vaccination rates, advising state and organizations on building grassroots networks, and teaching constituents how to communicate with lawmakers. Rekha holds a master's degree in healthcare administration from Texas Women's University and a BA in government from the University of Texas at Austin. Rekha has been instrumental in our research on vaccine policy at the Baker Institute over the years and has been an invaluable resource to me personally. She is a strong advocate for vaccine policy, vaccinations, and a great collaborator. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, Rekha.
Great, thank you, Kirsten, and good afternoon, everyone. Over time, U.S. vaccine policy has moved from a science and public health issue to one involving the perceived infringement of civil liberties. Assertions of an individual's right to self-determination, at times accompanied by scientific misinformation, have been set against effective, efficient strategies to protect the public's health. The controversies surrounding the development and future use of a COVID-19 vaccine illustrates this shift. Today's webinar is a Q&A format with our distinguished guests. If you would like to ask a question to our speakers at any time during the discussion, please enter it into the Q&A tab, which we are monitoring. To discuss vaccine research, clinical trials, and the approval process are Dr. Peter Hotez and Dr. Peter Marks. And just to give a little bit of background on both of our speakers today, Dr. Hotez is the Baker Institute Fellow for Disease and Poverty and the Dean for the National School of Tropical Medicine at Baylor College of Medicine. He is also a professor of pediatrics and a professor of molecular virology and microbiology. Dr. Hotez holds an MD and PhD and is internationally recognized physician scientist with expertise in neglected infectious diseases and vaccine development. He has authored over 550 publications and 4 single author books. He appears frequently on major news outlets promoting global health, vaccines and immunizations, and countering anti-vaccine and anti-science movements. Dr. Peter Marks is the director of the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, also known as CBER, at the Food and Drug Administration, which is responsible for assuring the safety and the effectiveness of biological products, including vaccines, allergenic products, blood and blood products, and cellular, tissue, and gene therapies. He joined the FDA in 2012 as Deputy Center Director for CBER and became Center Director in 2016. Dr. Marks received an MD and PhD in cell and molecular biology from New York University. He's board certified in internal medicine, hematology, and medical oncology, and is a fellow of the American College of Physicians. He worked several years in the pharmaceutical industry on the clinical development of hematology and oncology products, as well as leading the adult leukemia service, and served as chief clinical officer of Smillo Cancer Hospital at Yale University. We are honored to have our speakers today, and see. And I believe Dr. Marks may be experiencing a little bit of technical difficulty getting into the room. So let's just go ahead and get started because we have a lot to cover this afternoon regarding vaccines. So I have a few questions to begin the discussion as our audience sends in their questions. And Dr. Hotez, I would like to start with you. There is a lot of discussion going on this week about COVID-19 vaccines. We know the FDA is meeting towards the end of the week to discuss and evaluate the first COVID-19 vaccine, which is the Pfizer BioNTech COVID vaccine. And obviously this vaccine, as well as the Moderna vaccine, both have completed their phase 3 trials. And would you mind just taking a couple of minutes to talk about these two specific vaccines since they are RNA based? Can you briefly describe how these RNA vaccines work?
Sure. Well, in some ways, well, first of all, Rekha, thanks for having me. I think when we think about the mRNA vaccines, we think of it as a very exotic technology. In fact, all of the vaccines that we've been hearing about, whether it's Moderna or Pfizer or AstraZeneca, Oxford or J&J or our vaccine, which we're scaling up to produce in India now, they're scaling up production and it's now being tested in 5 sites in India, all work via the same principle. They all work by inducing an immune response to the spike protein, particularly inducing what are called virus neutralizing antibodies. So this is actually based on work that we began more than a decade ago. And I think that's important to say because, there's this erroneous thinking that somehow these vaccines materialized out of the blue, magically appeared, when in fact it builds on more than a decade of research. So when people say these vaccines are rushed, how could they have done it in such an incredible amount of time? They didn't. It built on more than a decade of research and development, careful studies by our group and many other groups internationally showing that the spike protein is the weak link or the soft target of the coronavirus, whether it's SARS-1 or MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, SARS, a severe acute respiratory syndrome, or COVID-19, that is the weak link. And we did a lot of work and others showing that delivering the spike protein as a vaccine was the best way to induce those virus neutralizing antibodies and get protection. And so what happened was back in January, when the Chinese scientists put up the sequence of the spike protein of COVID-19 on a preprint server known as bioRxiv, in some ways, the entire vaccine community breathed a sigh of relief because we knew we had this, because we'd developed coronavirus vaccines before, all involving the spike protein. Now that we had the sequence of the spike protein, we had some reasonable level of confidence this could work as a COVID-19 vaccine. And then the groups each set out with the technology that they were best at in order to apply it to COVID-19. So we thought doing this through an old-fashioned approach, meaning a genetically engineered recombinant protein in yeast, the same way used to make the hepatitis B vaccine was the way to go. Moderna and Pfizer were excited about their relatively new mRNA approach, and AstraZeneca, Oxford, and J&J, their adenovirus-based approach, and so forth. And then it was an attempt to see how expeditiously we could move without compromising safety. Now, the advantage of the mRNA approach is speed at the front end, meaning that that you can make a piece of RNA in a day, literally, corresponding to the genetic code of the spike protein that the Chinese had put up. And then it's a matter of packaging it and delivering it. In our case, the advantages are more at the downstream end because there's that long history of safety that we have with recombinant protein vaccines being made in yeast. So, I'm often asked which vaccine should I take, and I say, look, they're all going to work. They're all going to induce an immune response to the spike protein. So that's a preface. That's a long preface, Rekha, to your question. And just so the direct answer then is in the case of the mRNA approach, it's a pretty exciting technology. That piece of messenger RNA has to be stabilized because RNA, those of us who've done molecular biology for years or decades know that mRNA or RNA in general is one of the most unstable molecules there is in the laboratory. It breaks down very quickly. So the key is trying to stabilize it within a lipid envelope or an oil envelope. And even then, it could still be a bit unstable. And that's the reason for the deep freeze. That's the reason why you have to keep it in the Pfizer vaccine at minus 94 degrees Fahrenheit, because that's how you can lower any contaminating enzymes that could break it down, what are called RNases. So what this vaccine does after it's injected, the mRNA is actually taken up by your cells, probably a muscle cell, but it never goes into the nucleus. It never gets incorporated into your genetic material. And that's important to know because, of course, the anti-vaccine lobby is out there and they're already putting up misinformation saying that the mRNA vaccines are going to cause, they have a new term now, genetically modified humans. You've heard of genetically modified organisms. Now there's genetically modified humans. It doesn't happen. The RNA does not go into the nucleus for the simple reason that we don't have an enzyme called reverse transcriptase that can turn the RNA into DNA to get incorporated into our genome. So that never happens. It stays in the outer part of the cell, the cytoplasm. It's made into protein by our own host cell machinery, and that's presented to the immune system. So the advantage is you can make RNA very quickly. So if you have a new pathogen, you could respond accordingly. And the only question is, would it work as well as older, more classical technologies? And these clinical trials through Operation Warp Speed have indeed confirmed that they give really good levels of virus neutralizing antibody, particularly if you get 2 doses. So you really need 2 doses to really get it up there. And then you actually get quite high levels of protection on the order of 95% protection. What we don't know is how durable that's going to be, because this is a brand new technology. We've never immunized this many people with an mRNA vaccine. And the big question is going to be, will this durability last for 3 months or 3 years or 30 years? We don't know. Are both mRNA vaccines from Moderna and Pfizer equivalent, or are there going to be differences? We don't know. So this is going to take time to find out. But the point is, don't wait. If you have access to one of these vaccines, you want to get those virus neutralizing antibodies into your system, because we know that's what's going to keep you out of the hospital, out of the intensive care unit, and save your life. And even if it turns out that this vaccine is not very durable in protection, I have no reason to be worried about it, but it is a possibility because it's a new vaccine. You know what? It's okay. You can always get a 3rd dose later on, either with the same vaccine or a different vaccine, but get those virus neutralizing antibodies into your system. It'll save the lives of you or your loved ones.
Well, I'm glad you briefly touched upon some of the misinformation that is already circulating out there about these RNA-based vaccines, and myths such as can these vaccines alter our DNA or genome? So thank you for sharing that with the audience. One question from one of our viewers is, what are the side effects to watch for with these vaccines, and who is most susceptible to them?
Well, we've learned, I was sort of complaining up until this morning that all we knew about these vaccines were from company press releases. And that's not a good way to do science. As I like to point out, company press releases are released by companies. They're not for you. They're not for me. They're meant for the shareholders. And it's nice to have objective, independent review. And now we've got that. And so the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, and CBER, that's headed by Peter Marks, has released a document. And it looks as though there are side effects from the vaccine. Possibly it's a little worse than the 2nd dose. And it seems to be related with aspects of what happens when you stimulate our innate immune system and inflammatory response. So that would be pain at the site of injection, possibly muscle aches, possibly fever, possibly feeling fatigued for a day. Nothing too out of the ordinary. When I got my Shingrix vaccine, I had a similar reaction for a day. And it's worth it because of the life-saving protection that it affords. So I don't think it's going to be too untoward. One lesson though for employees to take home is because it may have some side effects for a day. For instance, if you're in a hospital running a hospital setting and you have all of your staff working in an intensive care unit, you may not want to vaccinate them all on the same day because they'll all feel crummy for a day, and there may be some absenteeism that day. And so that's something to keep in mind as an employer, that you may want to stagger your essential personnel to make certain not everybody is going to be out that particular day. We don't know that, and it may only be in a small percentage of individuals, but that's a piece to keep in mind. Looking at the information released from the FDA this morning, and I see Dr. Marks has joined, so that's I'll leave it to Dr. Marks to comment on the specifics. There's no point in bringing coals to Newcastle. So.
Wonderful. Welcome, Dr. Marks. We're so glad you were able to get through and join us this afternoon.
I am terribly sorry to be late. I'm using a different internet connection than I usually do, and it took a while to get through where I'm working right now. Sorry.
No worries at all. And we also know between you and Dr. Hotez, you both have extremely busy schedules. So we were just chatting with Dr. Hotez about the mRNA technology and kind of what is on the horizon for all of us.
Yeah, I was just
heard about the past 10 minutes. I heard about the past 10 minutes.
Oh, okay. So oh, that's great. That's great. Good to see you, Peter.
Good. Dr. Marks, we've got a question for you. So as we shared with our audience, we're doing this in a Q&A format. So we've got a few questions to kind of kick off the discussion, and then we have audience questions coming in as the two of you are speaking. But we shared your bio with our audience, and many on the call may not be familiar with CBER. So would you mind taking a few minutes to briefly explain to our audience the role of the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research in the drug and vaccine development process? And I think you're on mute.
Yep. So I'll give you the short, long explanation here. So the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research is responsible for the more complex biologic products, including blood products, cell and gene therapies, and vaccines. It has a very long history of regulating vaccines. We've been regulating vaccines since before the Food and Drug Administration. And in fact, the precursor to the Center for Biologics was founded in 1903 by the Biologics Control Act of 1902. Honestly, I always forget whether license 1 or license 2 was to smallpox vaccine. The other, it's either diphtheria antitoxin was 1 or 2, and smallpox was 1 or 2, and I'll always forget. But we've been doing this for a while, and what we understand, because we were actually part of the National Institutes of Health until 1972 when we became part of the FDA, is the tremendous importance of manufacturing in the production of vaccines. Quality manufacturing is very important. And it's from quality products that you get good safety and efficacy. And so we are responsible for making sure that the products are made well, quality products, that they are safe, they're effective. And we do that by our regulatory review process. We also do that by work that is sometimes done in our laboratories. For instance, for influenza vaccines, we release each lot in some manner or another. We have a lot release program. Although we only test a certain number of lots, we also have paper release of others. So we do a variety of things to ensure the safety of the vaccine supply, including pharmacovigilance on vaccines that are deployed. So I think that this puts us in a pretty good position right now to be looking at these vaccines, giving given we have really a world-class workforce of dozens of infectious disease experts, statisticians, experts in chemistry, manufacturing, controls that are able to look at these vaccines. They're doing so in the context of the experience that they've had with other investigational vaccines. So, for instance, although these first two mRNA vaccines are kind of leading the pack of emergency use authorization candidates, although someone could say, well, look, these are the first coming along that are going to be deployed, our reviewers have had experience with mRNA vaccines that have been on an investigational basis previously. So this isn't the first time they've seen this class of products. And they have some pretty good ideas of what to look for here. And I think Dr. Hotez did a great job of explaining the rest of the issues with the mRNA vaccines, including the fact that they're not going to transform people into monsters, which is, I think, very important because there is tremendous, I think what Dr. Hotez said cannot be under stressed. There is tremendous distrust out there for vaccines. And unfortunately, I would probably sound like Mr. Rogers, but vaccines are your friends.
Let me just add to that also is, Peter's absolutely right, is I sometimes joke with both Peter and Steve Hahn that I should send invoices to be your publicist, but it is the American people are only really hearing about CBER, I think, for the first time. It's not a household word, but it should be. I mean, there is no organization that has a greater track record at releasing safe and effective vaccines than the FDA and CBER. Really an extraordinary track record, and not only in ensuring that only safe vaccines are released, but also in the monitoring after these vaccines are licensed. It is one of the most extraordinary professional groups of vaccine scientists I know of. And, I've had the opportunity to work with CBER now for a couple of decades because all of our vaccines are regulated through CBER and the FDA, and it's a very interesting relationship. They are incredibly smart scientists that provide really good advice and thoughtful advice. And one of the things I like about FDA and CBER is they're not cookie cutter. They don't prescribe beforehand certain aspects of vaccines. They look at each vaccine individually and really think about the science behind it. And this is important to know because, there's a lot of worry about this thing called Operation Warp Speed, which is a name I don't like at all because it implies that vaccines are rushed or not adequately tested for safety. The Warp Speed part was never the clinical trials. Those are being done with the highest level of scientific rigor and integrity. The Warp Speed part is more around the manufacturing in parallel at the same time, so there's not a time lag. The communications out of Operation Warp Speed has been as it should be. There hasn't been that regular and periodic communication coming from government scientists. It's too often it's come from the pharma CEOs, in part, I think, by design from Operation Warp Speed. That part has not gone as well. But in terms of the integrity of the studies, the manufacturing, quality control, and quality assurance, that's actually the hard part of the vaccine. Let me give you an example. So, when the Russians started doing a lot of chest thumping around their Sputnik V or Sputnik 5 vaccine as though they had made some extraordinary scientific accomplishment. We've known for 10 years that the spike protein is the soft link in this virus for coronaviruses in general. And we've known about how to make adenoviruses for a long time. It was never a heroic scientific accomplishment. The hard part is doing all of this with quality control, quality assurance, integrity of clinical trials under good clinical practices. And that's the game. That's the differentiator between vaccines coming out of the United States versus what Russia was doing, which was approving even before phase 3 clinical trials. And And that's what the U.S. taxpayers have been paying for all along. And even when there's an emergency, even through emergency use authorization, I can't tell you how many Zoom calls with Peter through our NIH active group or with Dr. Hahn, and working really hard to approximate as close as possible the full licensure process without waiting that extra year. Because when you have 2,000 or 3,000 Americans dying every day, you do the math, and it's just a staggering loss of life. So that was never really an option. So it's trying to thread that needle of getting vaccines released in a timely manner to the public without compromising safety. I think it's extraordinary what FDA and CBER have done in order to do that, like no other regulatory authority can do.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Maybe can I just pick up by saying that I think one of the things that was a key insight here from the beginning was that we realized that we might have to use this emergency use authorization authority in order to be able to get something out there faster than the biologics license pathway. And the biologics license pathway in the United States is a pretty high standard. The products have to have substantial evidence of effectiveness from adequate, well-controlled trials, and that's defined in our guidance as for vaccines generally. Those are trials involving thousands and thousands of patients, generally with safety data sets of at least 3,000 patients. And the average clinical trial program for a vaccine, and we actually calculated it, it's 2,750 patients. So these are 21,750 patients. That's a lot of individuals. These trial programs that we're seeing here for these coronavirus vaccines are roughly double that size, or almost in some cases. The important piece, though, is that for an emergency use authorization, there is kind of a floor of what we have to have as a minimum to be able to use it. And that floor is just that the product may be effective and its known potential benefits outweigh its known and potential risks. But what we realized is that that was just not going to be good enough for a preventative vaccine for a healthy person. Something that might be effective, that doesn't really sound very, it doesn't sound very encouraging. Now, if you have a life-threatening disease and something might be effective, you might say, that's not such a bad thing. But for something that you're going to give to healthy people, we realized that we would have to set that bar higher. And that's why in guidance that we put out in October, we made it very clear that there would be a higher bar here and that we would expect these to be have clear and compelling evidence of effectiveness, which was a code word for saying it's going to be pretty close to a biologics license application type clinical trial program. The part that we don't have, that we can't, you can compress certain things, but you can't compress others. And the part that we have to acknowledge we won't have is the longer term safety follow-up. And that means that we have to put together an overlapping process of pharmacovigilance with Centers for Disease Control and other government agencies. So we really look at the longer term safety of these vaccines. But right now, there's nothing of particular concern. We know that most of the serious adverse events become apparent within a median of about 2 months. Actually, it's not even a median of 2 months. I misspoke. Most become apparent within 2 months, and we've asked for a median of 2 months of follow-up on these in these trials. So we'll continue to follow the patients, the individuals in the trial, participants in the trial, and we'll continue to have a very large-scale surveillance effort, an active surveillance effort using large databases, and a passive surveillance effort using reporting into the adverse event database, the vaccine adverse event database. And the CDC has put together a text-based reminder for people to opt into to report adverse events. So we hope by putting that all together, it will compensate for the lack of longer-term follow-up as we move these forward.
Well, along those lines, the past, couple of weeks have been a flurry of meetings. And again, this week, there is a lot to watch for. Last Thursday, the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices approved interim recommendations for the first priority group for COVID vaccine, which include healthcare workers. And then, of course, there's a meeting towards the end of this week when VRBPAC, another acronym that many are learning about, and VRBPAC stands for the Vaccines and Related Biologics Products Advisory Committee. They are a group within the FDA. Could you just take a couple of minutes and explain kind of what the purpose of the VRBPAC meeting is, and specifically what the FDA is going to be looking for as they evaluate the COVID vaccine candidate data, which is obviously Pfizer's vaccine this week? Ooh, Dr. Berkshire.
Sorry.
No worries.
Sorry about that. In 2 words, it's reality testing. Not quite, but what we do at FDA is we go through these files very carefully. Unlike other regulators, we start from the data that's submitted and we reconstruct the analysis. So that's why this briefing book that was put out, obviously we have Pfizer's briefing book that's out there right now, and as well as our review and our briefing book that was put out there today. And that represents a tremendous amount of work going through and looking at the different aspects here. The reason to ask the advisory committee to look at these data is to have an independent group, in this case of 15 or 20 experts, that include experts in coronaviruses, experts in vaccinology, statisticians, a patient representative, and actually an industry representative, to look at the data and to make sure that we haven't missed something that is important. It helps make sure that it's an external check to make sure that what we've seen looks right. It's an external check on the company, and it allows us to get feedback to see if the advisory committee comes to the same conclusion by looking at the data that we do. And that's why after the advisory committee, they make a recommendation. That recommendation is not binding on FDA, but the large part of the time we follow the recommendations of advisory committees. And that will help us understand whether it makes sense to authorize one of these. But there's another piece of this that's really important. The piece that we do at FDA is essentially secret, because all of the inside our deliberations, we are beholden to keep the information on, like manufacturing, et cetera. This is all trade secret information. Some of it is commercial confidential information. But by having the advisory committee, we have an opportunity that both FDA and the public then are able to have this discussion in public. And it allows one not just to talk about the good points, but also there's always, any product is going to have some issues that need to be discussed. And that allows that to happen in a public venue so that people can see that there's no cover up here. There's no one trying to pull the wool over anyone's eyes. That all we're trying to do is help bring forward products that will potentially be of benefit if we all agree that they are what they say they are, to help end this pandemic. So that's the goal here, to have that transparency.
I think, Peter and CBER have done an extraordinary job ensuring that this product is going to be safe and effective. I think that for me, the 2 unknowns about this vaccine are, one, how long protective immunity will last. Is it going to be 3 months or 3 years or 30 years? That's going to be important to know, but that should not be a barrier to taking it, right? Because you need virus neutralizing antibodies into your system. And if it turns out that the antibody titers wane or immunity wears off after a few months, it's okay, because you could potentially get a boost either with the same vaccine, maybe a different vaccine if the studies support it. I think the other unknown is how robust the technology is for scale up and producing it for the American people. We'll have to see, because it is a new technology, and that's why I'm of the opinion we're going to need other vaccines to come along, and you don't want to really put all your eggs in the mRNA vaccine basket. It'd be good to have additional ones, and that's probably going to follow. We'll have other adenovirus vaccines coming along. We're actually scaling up production of a recombinant protein vaccine in India. BioE is producing 1 billion doses of our recombinant protein COVID vaccine now being tested in 5 sites in India. So maybe that'll come along later. So I think the way to look at it is that with each passing month, starting in January, things will start to get better as we vaccinate more and more of the American population, not only with the mRNA vaccines, but other vaccines that are going to come along as well. So I think, there's a possibility that we could have a small fleet of different vaccines by the middle of the spring. And I guess hear from Peter, I think that maybe is an aspirational goal, but potentially doable.
So Dr. Hotez, kind of along oh, go ahead, Dr. Barks, please.
No, so I was going to just say, completely agree. And I think this concept of having some diversity here in the vaccines that are available is going to be important. Also, because when you have any product that is as important as this vaccine, you don't want all your eggs in one basket. Since I've been at the FDA for 9 years, and I've witnessed spectacular manufacturing failures because a plant blows up, an autoclave takes out a production line, and you would hate to have everything in one basket here. So some diversity here is good, given that this is a vaccine that we're going to need literally billions of doses of, or these vaccines.
Right. Thank you. And so I just wanted to take a couple of steps back and just kind of thread out a comment you made, Dr. Hotez, about kind of the longevity and kind of, how long are these vaccines gonna last? And so we have a question about what happens if not everyone gets the second dose? Because as of right now, both Moderna, the 2 vaccines that are under consideration are 2 doses. So what happens if not everyone gets the second dose? And then a follow-up to that is, how rigid do you see the schedule being? So in case, people can't come back within that 21, 24-day window, if there's a little bit of a delay, do you see an impact on the effectiveness or the efficaciousness of the vaccine?
Well, before I saw the document from FDA, I had one answer. Now I've got a slightly different answer. So so before today, looking at the phase 1, phase 2 clinical trial data, which was all we had released to the public, was that the level of virus neutralizing antibodies after 1 dose was not very high. You really needed 2 doses to really get high levels of virus neutralizing antibody up there. And on that basis, I would have thought that you would not see much in the way of protective immunity after a single dose. But now, this is the great thing about science. There's nothing like actually doing studies to refute dogma. So today, the FDA came out with some information that says, no, there could be some protective immunity even after a single dose. I think Peter is clearly the best to address that.
Yeah, so I think what this is actually a great example of having data out there and realizing how careful we have to be, because the press has actually gotten actually the protection after a single dose is not that has been reported because they have those data, because they know how many people, they had a large enough sample that they knew who got COVID-19 between vaccine and vaccine 1 and vaccine 2. And I think that's helpful. It's not perfect by any means, but it shows that there's some protection there. And I think that's it's important to view the fact that most people in the trial ended up getting the second dose, and it's probably important to get the second dose because remember, we're trying to get up to high rates of immunity here so that we stop the spread of this. So I think we have to be careful about anyone getting excited about just taking one dose. I mean, it's wonderful. To me, it's wonderful that you get some protection after one dose because something is better than nothing. But I think the fact that we get up to these high reported rates of protection after 2 doses, that's going to be a really nice thing to have.
And both of you mentioned the importance of having a wide variety of vaccines available for healthcare providers to vaccinate the population. And this is a question for either one of you, which is, when can we anticipate, the vaccine, number one, being available for the broader public, and when other manufacturers, such as the AstraZeneca vaccine or Johnson & Johnson, when do you expect or anticipate them coming online to kind of help fill and round out that gap?
I'm going to let Dr. Hotez take that one because he's at more liberty to speculate than I can.
Well, that's Peter's nice way of saying he has the answer, but he's not allowed to say. So, I mean, I think what will happen is we'll start seeing the other vaccines come online starting in late winter, early spring. And I can't say which is going to be the next one up. I think the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine, they released some information on an interim analysis today, got published in the Lancet, and it definitely has some promise, but there's probably going to be a need to complete a phase 3 trial in the US before that gets up. So I would say sometime in the spring, maybe. And then hopefully the J&J and Novavax vaccine won't be followed too long. So the hope is that by April or May, we could have potentially 4 or even 5 vaccines vaccinating the US population. And that's really exciting. That's the good news. The not so good news is, we did an analysis with a group at City University of New York that was headed by Bruce Lee, who's an excellent modeler originally at Johns Hopkins in Pittsburgh. And, we found together that to actually interrupt transmission of the virus, you need quite a high percentage of the US population vaccinated, maybe 60 to 80%, even with a high performing vaccine. So that's a pretty high bar. And we also don't know all the full performance characteristics of these vaccines. We know they do the most important thing we want, which is if we get vaccinated, it'll keep us out of the hospital or the intensive care unit. What we don't know is how well it stops what we call asymptomatic transmission, meaning that you could be vaccinated, get exposed to the virus, and still get the infection and be shedding virus in your upper airway, in your nose and mouth, and transmitting virus. I don't know that that's going to happen, but it's a possibility. And so there's some studies planned to really look at that. And ideally, you would like vaccines that not only prevent symptomatic infection, severe illness, but actually stop that asymptomatic transmission. Then if you have that, and then if you have the 60, 80% coverage, we can actually talk about vaccinating our way out of this pandemic because we can actually interrupt transmission. Then, of course, and we could talk about this next, we've got all the issues about compliance and then our favorite anti-vaccine movement to how we're going to counteract that. I'd just be curious on Peter's viewpoint on that.
Yeah, I couldn't, you said it so well. I don't know what else I can add to that. I mean, I think this question of, I mean, if there were 2 things that I could have, like if I had my magic wish, my genie for this, I would love to know right now, today, whether these vaccines can prevent transmission or carriage and then transmission, because that would be really helpful to know. And the second thing I'd like to know is how long they're going to be durable in terms of the durability of these. And if I had to add my third, probably, and this is roughly in order, would be, does this particular virus, is this going to have strain drift or mutation such that we're going to see the need to come back and vaccinate year after year. I hope that's not the case, but I don't think we know for a fact that it's not the case. And Dr. Hotez may want to comment more. He's a real infectious disease doctor. I just make believe that I can do this stuff.
Well, all we really can say is, the COVID-19 virus, the SARS coronavirus type 2 is an RNA virus, and RNA viruses do mutate. And we've already seen now they're mutating enough so we can see different lineages of the virus. That's how we know that the virus that caused that terrible epidemic in New York in March and April came in from Europe at the end of January or early February. But whether those lineage differences actually translate into how the virus behaves or causes disease, we don't know. There's some papers suggesting that the one of the mutations that's especially now widely occurring in Houston, for instance, is more contagious than others. It's still not airtight about that. So far, I don't think any of the mutations in the virus spike protein that we've seen are enough to cause this immediate worry that the vaccines are not going to work. But this is going to be a moving goalpost. We'll have to watch. And I think this is the other message is, look at all the things we're talking about. How long does it protect? Does it stop asymptomatic transmission? Will there be mutation? There's going to have to be, given all of the economic and security implications of this virus, an unprecedented amount of communication between government scientists and the American people. And we don't have that channel of communication quite yet. Peter Marks has been great about, doing Zoom calls like this and communicating with the public, but how, moving forward, how do we do this on a more sort of systematic basis? Because the physicians in the community are just bombarding me with questions. And I'm sure if they're bombarding me, they're bombarding other scientists. And it says to me that there needs to be that the Biden administration will need to organize a more consistent and reliable source of communication on a frequent and regular basis. I don't know if it has to be like Andrew Cuomo up there every day, but something where the American people get to see a face and a person that they trust and know, and hearing from them on a regular basis is going to be really important, because there's going to be so much information and changing information, and being able to explain it and why what we're saying today may be different 3 weeks from now because we've learned new information, and not making it seem like we just missed the boat. We didn't. This is how science works.
Yeah, one thing I would also add is that although it's very exciting for us to be at this kind of right at the edge here of seeing the vaccines deployed as emergency use authorization, this is really just the beginning of how much more study is going to be needed of these vaccines, because we know we're going to need to understand their efficacy and their side effects in children, particularly younger children. We know that we're going to need to look at pregnant women, and we're going to need to figure out whether we can give these vaccines along with other vaccines, because we might as well learn that right now in case we're going to be doing this in the future, because you'd like to know if you can give someone the flu vaccine and this vaccine ultimately at the same time, if we have to start doing this on an annual basis. Again, these are things that, although they may sound silly or mundane in practice, when you have somebody in the office, you want to get them the vaccines that they need, preferably together if you can, to reduce visits. So we'll be asking people to look at that. So lots of things, and that's aside from the larger three issues that I brought up already.
And along the lines of children, do you envision, pediatric trials still being randomized control trials with placebo, or just an open label trial?
No, I think we're going to have, I think what we're very lucky about is that with these large trials, I think that very soon we'll be able to feel comfortable that we understand immune correlates of protection enough so that we won't be doing, there may be some some kids that will get that might get a placebo for a part of the trial, but these won't be long trials the same way. It's not going to be a randomized trial the same way that we've done for adults, because we'll be looking at shorter trials, looking at immune correlates of protection to understand what dose we need to use as children get smaller. The way these work is we generally will start, we already have some data in the 12 to 15 year age group. We'll get more data in that group. Then we'll go down to 7 to 12 or 5 to 12. Then we'll go down from that. See, as you get below age 12, then the dose may have to start to be adjusted. And so it is nice to be able to rely on these immune correlates of protection, either antibody levels or cellular immunity assays, to be able to expedite getting these results instead of needing months. It will hopefully be a shorter time. Although I have to say that, because of the very high rate of COVID-19 right now, it's not hard to get clinical cases, but we just would rather not have to do that. And with children who could be more asymptomatic than adults, it's probably better to be looking here at immune correlates. And I'll let Dr. Hotez give the correct answer now.
Well, no, I think that's right. I think the other piece to this, though, I mentioned that 60 to 80% benchmark. It's going to be hard to get there without vaccinating kids. So I do think this is going to be really important to move forward on. And then there's also going to have to be a lot of communication and public relations, because parents may be less eager to vaccinate with an mRNA vaccine that has not been around as long compared to another technology. So that's going to have to be discussed, whether the compliance level is going to be as high. It's all going to be about leadership and communication. So I think that's going to be important. Pregnant women, I think, are also going to be very important, because we've seen severe COVID-19 in pregnant women, and especially here in Houston, in our Texas Children's Hospital, which is a women and children's hospital. That's going to be a big concern. So, and then the other question I'm often asked about are specialty populations. Those who are immunocompromised, getting Humira or one of the other monoclonal antibodies that affect the immune system, people with autoimmune disease. And I guess I'd ask Peter, at what point do we start learning information about those groups, and when do they get brought in?
Yeah, I think we're going to be starting to want to learn about them pretty soon, because they would be people who I think are willing to participate in trials, and where we need to be able to do something, because the COVID-19 in immunocompromised patients or patients who have hematologic cancers that take out their immune system, they are in desperate need of some protection. So we'll want to see studies there. How those are exactly sequenced in this, I can't tell you. Whether they'll start next month, the month after for these. There are so many different studies that need to happen, but they definitely need to be done. And I think we feel like we have enough data already that I don't think there's a large concern, at least for these vaccines. Now, one of the things that we always have to say as a regulator is we take each vaccine on its own merit. So the what I'm saying for an mRNA vaccine or a protein-based vaccine might not be the same as what would apply to a live virus vaccine. So each of these will have to be looked at separately.
Well, in our kind of closing minutes of our time together, this is for both of you, and Dr. Hotez alluded to it earlier regarding misinformation, and you did as well, Dr. Marks. Obviously we've seen several polls and data indicating both that the public is hesitant about vaccines, as well as having concern about the process. And so What kind of reassurance can you give listeners who are concerned the vaccine development process has been rushed? And this is a two-parter. And the second question is, many on the line are community advocates. You know, they're out there every day talking to people. And what recommendations do you have for community partners to do to help improve vaccine confidence?
Well, I'll just say very briefly that you're right. I mean, the polls are looking, for the surveys coming out of Reuters and Associated Press and the Pew Research Center look pretty ominous in terms of the percentage of Americans who are willing to get vaccinated. Having said that, all of those polls that I know of were done before we had the 95% protection information coming from Pfizer and Moderna. So maybe some of that now will diminish. I also think, as people see colleagues and friends getting vaccinated with no untoward effect, that's going to have an amplifying effect in terms of people willing to get vaccinated. So I do think things will improve. Peter knows better than anyone how politicized vaccines were this summer, and that had a detrimental effect. I'm hoping some of that wears off. But they're going to be that piece that is heavily influenced by a very aggressive and anti-vaccine movement that includes targeting a specific ethnic groups, even targeting the African-American community, staging rallies in Harlem last year and early this year, and using very inflammatory language, claiming vaccines are the next Tuskegee experiment and this kind of stuff. It's very damaging. So I'm of the opinion that and then run a lot of calls. In fact, I'm going on an NVAC call after this, which is a lot of emphasis on how we're going to do that messaging and amplify the message. And I think all that's really important. But then I say, there's one other piece to this. It's not just getting the message out there, because the message so far is a message in a bottle in the Atlantic Ocean, because the anti-vaccine groups are so dominant on the internet and on social media. And how do we begin launching that counter approach to it is going to be really critical. And I don't see how we're going to get away without doing it. They've become too dominant. And, I see they target both Peters here. They target both of us, and it's very tough going up against them.
Yeah, from my perspective, I first of all, there's a lot of mutual respect and admiration here, right? And I think the real issue from FDA's point is we exist because we are here to protect the American public. We have a group of scientists who come to work, or they go home, where they're working at home at work right now, and they are completely devoted to making sure that whatever they do, that these vaccines are safe and effective, and that they are going to be of a quality that they would want to take themselves, and that they would want their families to take, and that they feel comfortable for the rest of the country to take. And I think as community advocates, you need to understand, we have a diverse workforce. That diverse workforce works very hard to make sure that these vaccines are doing what they're supposed to be across the different types of people that it's supposed to be doing it. And that we're not gonna let something out there that we're not comfortable taking ourselves. And so I'm hoping that we can combat this vaccine hesitancy, because this concept that vaccines haven't made a huge impact on public health, it's rubbish. I mean, you might as well say you want to mix your sewage and your drinking water again if you don't believe that vaccines have made a big difference. So we need people to understand that vaccines have made a huge difference in this world. Scourges like smallpox were eliminated. Polio, we don't know what polio looks like anymore because you don't see it. And frankly, there are certain forms of measles where kids get very, very sick and die, which we don't see either, because we have a relatively high vaccination rate for measles, although perhaps not high enough recently. So we need people to develop that trust in vaccines here. We can come together as a country around this. We don't have to be divided around this. This is actually, we have a mutual enemy here, it's in the size of a microscopic particle, and we should all want to help work together to do what we can to get rid of it. And in this case, it does mean vaccination, but by gosh, vaccination is just mimicking what our immune systems do every day, which is we're exposed to things in the environment and we make an immune response. It's a way of helping that to happen. And in this case, to a very beneficial effect of helping to eliminate something that's really disrupted our way of life in an incredible manner. So I would also say finally that the most important thing we would suggest is what Dr. Hotez is also suggesting, which is communication, and over communication, so that the messages, it's not going to be perfect. It's not, no one's going to go out and say that there are no side effects of these vaccines, but by communicating and being honest about this, my hope is that we'll finally overtake these messages that are just, they don't make sense. So we have a good message and we should get it out there.
Well, I know we're right up at time, but just the final question around information. What are some reliable sources of information that the audience can view to kind of keep up with the progress of vaccine as well as general information on COVID? Do either of you have sources you kind of lean on to stay up to date?
I'll let the other Peter go first.
Well, yeah, I think Dr. Hotez will probably have more. I would say that, the Center for Disease Control and the FDA websites, we keep them updated reasonably well. People can go there to get information, which we've tried to make digestible in a format that is not highly technical. And so I think those are good websites to visit for some general information. There are obviously other websites, and some including even some very good local health department websites. But let me turn it over to Dr. Hotez.
Yeah, pretty much. The CDC, FDA website, CDC. I like the CDC website because I know where to look for things, but I also have an MD and a PhD, and that does make it easier. And so I sometimes think it's not as straightforward for non-technical people, but there's an enormous amount of information. It's just sometimes hard to locate it at times. Other things, the vaccine education website of Children's Hospital of Philadelphia has some good information. The Vaccinate Your Family has some good information. Also, the New York Times section on COVID-19 and keeping up with information about COVID-19 has been really helpful as well. Sort of debunking the anti-vaccine myths, it's hard to keep up because they move the goalposts just as soon as you think you have your arms around debunking vaccines cause autism, they pivot towards vaccines cause chronic illness, and so you're always kind of one step behind. But I have that book, Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism, which has sort of that information there. It needs an update now on vaccines did not cause all the other stuff that they say it does. We have a paper under review trying to look at refuting the major myths around COVID-19 vaccines with Heidi Larson and a few others. So that'll be helpful as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again to both. We are certainly out of time, and I know there were a lot of questions that came through, and we will try to answer those questions in a Baker blog post. But on behalf of the Baker Institute and the Immunization Partnership and everyone on the call, we would like to thank both you, Dr. Marks and Dr. Hotez, for sharing your insights and for a lively discussion, as well as everyone in the audience for joining us this afternoon. Thank you to each of you for what you do. We know it's a hard job, but we are so lucky to have both of you at the forefront looking after all of us. And as a reminder to our audience, if you want more information about Operation Warp Speed, we have a paper. It was included in the chat. You can also go to the Baker Institute website to access that. This is our last Center for Health and Biosciences webinar for the year. We wish all of you a great winter break, and make sure you get your flu vaccine, keep washing your hands, wear your mask. We'll see you again next year for 2 January webinars on science policy. And with that, we'll close, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Rekha. Thank you, Peter. It's good seeing you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Very good to see you. Thank you, Peter. Take care. Thank you, Rekha. Take care.